Good morning. I hope everybody slept well, had a nice evening yesterday, and is prepared for a interesting keynote lecture and discussion this morning. I'm pretty sure that we will have that. We touch base with this general subject of our conference, approaches to authenticity, the virtual versus the material versus the recreated. And I just love to introduce to you our distinguished keynote speaker, Erica Lehrer from Montreal, from Concordia University. She is a acknowledged sociocultural anthropologist and also exhibition curator and author of a number of important books. One is just about to come out about Jewish space in contemporary Poland, the volume she co-edited together with Michael Mann. And she's the author of the book Jewish Poland Revisited, Heritage Tourism in Unquiet Places. And the subject that she is talking about now to us to introduce the discussion, the subject is, you can all read it, Gentiles doing Jewish stuff and the troubled question of authenticity. I'm glad you're with us. Made the way from Canada to a place you visit pretty often, which is Warsaw, Poland. Please join us here. And we're curious to listen to you. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Well, thank you very much, Hanno, and also thank you to the board, association board, for this opportunity to speak, and also to learn from such a distinguished group of museologists, which museums are a field that increasingly interests me, both as a subject of investigation, but also as I make some rather unschooled forays into curating myself. So I was given the task today of speaking to the theme of this year's conference, approaches to authenticity, and specifically to talk about themes from my recently published book about Jewish heritage tourism in relation to Poland's broader heritage revival. And I have to say, I'm a bit intimidated by the monumental scale of this stage and also particularly the size of these slides, so apologies for this colossal advertisement. I wanted to start by simply recognizing that there are many different ways to talk about authenticity, each out of a particular system of value. So among them are our professions, our religions, and of course our own personal criteria. As an anthropologist, I see my role as trying to understand competing systems of value, which tell us about the social life of different groups. And to give a sense of what I mean, sociologist Howard Becker has a brilliant little rule of thumb that I actually like to use with my students, and it's called, "It isn't whatever." And you can fill in the blank here. So, for example, that isn't photography, that isn't science, that isn't Jewish. So all three of these are different kinds of that isn't, artistic, epistemological, and ethnic. That isn't authentic is one of these as well, or rather it sort of lies behind all of them. And Becker points out that whenever you hear this kind of statement, as a social scientist, your job is not to decide whether the statement is true, but to recognize it as an attempt to preserve a privilege. It's the speaker telling you how they would like to define the category in question. And looking at it this way opens the door to understanding many things about social life. This approach allows us to get at the stakes that lie behind all claims to authenticity. Exploring these claims reveals the values, the aspirations, the anxieties, and allegiances that members of social groups who are making these claims, as we all do. And as a good social scientist would also likely pay attention to the resources that different groups have to propagate or even potentially enforce their particular vision of authenticity. So with that brief introduction to sort of my approach to these questions, I'm going to offer you today some observations drawn from very micro-level ethnographic research, or what often gets called in the discipline as deep hanging out. And this asks what we can learn about Poland's Jewish heritage revival if we dispense with concerns about authenticity and take this different approach. And to just show my hand right up front, I'll say that I think that the challenges and the opportunities facing the unique and shifting terrain of Jewish cultural heritage in Poland and perhaps broader Europe today demand not the policing of boundaries that statements about authenticity provide, but rather the exploration of creative new possibilities for the re-engagement with and reinvention of Jewish culture and community in the long aftermath of its immeasurable destruction. I think my approach will be in productive dialogue with both Monika Adamczyk-Garbowska's invocation yesterday, or maybe it was 2 days ago, of pseudo-Jewish kitsch, and as well as with Konstanty Gebert's comment that experience is the only real driver of social change. And I hope in any event that my comments will offer a useful provocation that might offer some tools for your own thinking. So now turning to my research, I'm going to take us down to ground level, beginning in traditional anthropologist form with a scene of arrival. So I happened upon Kazimierz, Krakow's historic Jewish quarter, in 1990 as a sort of proto-Jewish tourist, shocked by the encounter with what looked like essentially a Jewish ghost town, the ruins of an entire pre-war Jewish world. But still more surprising was the fact that there was something there other than ruins. I fortuitously drove into the quarter under the banner of what was then the city's second annual Festival of Jewish Culture, which today, of course, is in its expansive 24th year, and it's televised nationwide. For whom, I tried to comprehend, was imported cantor Jeffrey Nadell of suburban Washington, D.C., singing there in Kazimierz? And why was there a Jewish bookshop in this ghost town? And were its owners really non-Jewish Poles? This trip for me was like entering a black and white photograph of a mythical idea of a very gray place called Poland. And yet, the emerging social landscape there kept generating these very confusing signs of Jewish life. It seemed quite surreal and quite inauthentic. And as I grew more engaged with the growing wave of Jewish return travel to Poland, of which I was de facto a part, I was particularly intrigued by the inability of Jews like myself to process, or in some ways even to recognize, this new Jewish cultural activity, whether it was undertaken by Jews or non-Jews. It simply didn't fit the very powerful narrative about what this country was in Jewish terms, namely a cemetery. I realized that in some meaningful way, the only authentic Jews that I and many people I encountered were prepared to accept in Poland were dead Jews. And as an aside, later I was to feel in rather good company when Kostek Gebert wrote of the open skepticism and dismissal with which Warsaw Ghetto Uprising hero Marek Edelman looked at Gebert and other young Polish Jews in the 1970s and 1980s when they were trying to make something meaningful out of their own newly discovered Jewish roots, because it was a process that involved much invention and imagination, and Edelman dismissed them as simply fake Jews. As it turned out, the inauthentic heritage tourism landscape that was beginning to develop in Kazimierz was really both a barometer of and also an entryway into historic events. The Jewish-themed shops and restaurants and the developing klezmer music scene were part of the emerging and sometimes tense fascination with Jewishness for Poles who had grown up in a Poland with almost no Jewish presence, but a very pervasive Jewish absence. The new displays of heritage also spoke to the increasing number of Jews who visited these sites, both as tourists and as locals. The core question that emerged for me had to do with the reasons behind and the terms of this fascination, and also, significantly, I think, the consequences for those who participated in this new Jewish cultural heritage scene. Now, a great many of the conversations that made up the research for my book took place in this very unique urban space that's both self-contained and also forms a crossroads for many different groups of people. This particular island of Kazimierz, the historic Jewish district of Krakow, was quite literally an island in the past. It was founded by King Casimir the Great, and Kazimierz was intended as a rival to the royal seat of Krakow, but with time it came to play a very important role for the local Jews. Expelled from Krakow in the 14th century, Jews settled in Kazimierz and turned it into one of the most important spaces of Jewish learning and rabbinic literature. Whoops. This is an image of Moses Isserlis, of course, and then also later on, Kazimierz was important for the popularization of Yiddish culture as well, and here's Mordechai Gebürtig. This quintessentially Jewish Kazimierz ended in 1941 when the Nazis evicted the Jews and forced them into a ghetto in the neighboring district of Podgórze. After the liquidation of the ghetto in 1943, Jewish life in Krakow nearly came to an end. But in the immediate post-war years, Kazimierz, which survived almost intact, saw a return of Holocaust survivors and began to serve again as a hub of Jewish community life, even though for many it was only a temporary stop and not a safe haven. Of course, the first post-war pogrom was in Kazimierz in 1945. In the communist period, Kazimierz, which retained almost all of its historic urban fabric, including 7 synagogues and 2 Jewish cemeteries, fell into disrepair and took on the character of a city slum. The status quo started to change in the early 1990s as the Jewish Culture Festival, which was to grow into the biggest such event in Europe, as well as the filming of Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List, started to attract tourists, artists, entrepreneurs, and others to the district. And this catalyzed a profound transformation which had both material and cultural dimensions. And here you can see the sort of old and more recently new Kazimierz. New Jewish-style cafes, restaurants, and bookstores mushroomed along Shiroka Street. The first klezmer bands formed and started giving regular concerts in Kazimierz's new venues. As Holocaust tourists and other travelers discovered the neighborhood, local culture brokers emerged in response, offering Jewish-themed guided tours and other services like assistance with genealogical research. As Kazimierz transformed into a tourist magnet, new kinds of spaces and cultural products came into being. One of these products was the klezmer revival. It produced a new diverse genre which embraced both Polish translations of Yiddish songs as well as new compositions inspired by both traditional music and Polish folk music. Another such new product were Jewish figurines or portraits of Jews, often sold as Lucky Charms. And this particular item became rather a fascination of mine, and I ended up curating what turned out, I think, to be a sort of productively provocative exhibition of the figurines in the summer of 2013. And this is the cover of the book that I published out of that exhibit. Jewish-themed tourist venues capitalize on the historic authenticity of the quarter. And by this, I mean the aura surrounding the surviving original street layout and architecture that many visitors sense. But brokers of Jewish cultures also sometimes artificially engineer the patina of time, creating an illusion of traveling into the past. There is new signage that references old, faded Yiddish inscriptions that are still partly visible on some original unrenovated houses. There are also new establishments that advertise themselves both in Polish and in Yiddish. The Hebrew-style font, or the mockingly creolized Yiddish names create the illusion of readability. And here, bumble in Polish means like a bubble or a blister. The Jewish element here is not only commodified, but it's also domesticated for the needs of new consumers who are drawn to Kazimierz by its mixture of exoticism and familiarity. So this is like Jewishness made accessible for non-Jewish Poles. But this considerable non-Jewish participation in transforming Kazimierz economically, culturally, and symbolically has taken place in the company of Jewish communal life, with a continuously operating Ramu synagogue and the seat of the Jewish community, the cemetery as well. This is the new cemetery, and the seat of the Jewish community. In recent years, Kazimierz's gentrification has further led to the expansion of Jewish spaces. So in 2009, the new JCC was erected next to the historic Temple Synagogue. A kosher food store opened in the Isaac Synagogue run by Chabad Lubavitchers. And kosher restaurants appear and disappear in Kazimierz with some regularity. So we have to understand the district as a site of continuous change and development, which in turn attracts new actors and is continuously responding to new demands. The emergence of Jewish heritage as a visibly commodified, consumable experience in Poland has been dismissed by both popular and scholarly observers. Years of news articles and widely circulated anecdotes have framed it on a spectrum from suspicious oddity to macabre escapist Disneyland, serving only the mercenary or misguided psychological interests of its presumably non-Jewish purveyors. To the extent that it has drawn serious attention, it's been largely criticized in the following terms. In terms of inauthenticity, in terms of cultural appropriation, so sort of a situation of injustice or economic exploitation, in terms of so-called philo-Semitism, which is generally seen not as what the etymology of the word might actually be, but rather a distorted form of anti-Semitism with negative consequences for Jews. And it's also been dismissed in terms of nostalgia, in other words, a sort of romanticized, celebratory, easily digestible vision of the past. At best, Kazimierz's most visible forms of Jewish heritage production are seen as irrelevant epiphenomena to the more important concerns of Jewish material heritage preservation and religious Jewish communal revival. This heritage revival is in turn often implicitly measured against a bar of either the rich pre-war Jewish reality or against a standard of normative Jewish life in contemporary Jewish communal centers in the West. But I want to suggest that a narrow focus on reconstituting a familiar version of Jewish communal life on pre-existing or imported models misses important new aspects of culture connected to Jewishness as both an idea and a reality. Poland's Jewish heritage revival is relevant to the social needs of both local and visiting Jews, as well as for the way that Poles define their own collective identity in the 21st century. So what I'd like to offer is a new paradigm for understanding Poland's Jewish heritage revival. Doing so makes visible and allows us to newly understand a much broader range of significance for the cultural phenomena under discussion. And in the rest of my talk, I will draw both from my own research as well as the work of my Polish colleague Magdalena Waligórska from her excellent recent book, Klezmer's Afterlife. In our separate but overlapping ethnographic analyses, we've each developed notions of Kazimierz as a particular kind of contact zone, focusing on processes that have been rendered invisible by this narrow approach that seeks Jewish authenticity. We concentrate instead on mechanisms of cultural critique, heritage caretaking, intergroup collaboration, and cross-cultural identification. And we'd like to offer these alternatives to the more commonly used discourses mentioned a couple of slides back for the ways that these can open up the phenomena in question to reveal new possibilities for learning, for dialogue, and for coming to terms with the difficult past. Magdalena and I both looked at ways to get away from defining Jewishness in Poland as authentic or inauthentic, as either simply good or bad. But instead, we tried to consider how it functioned. What kind of cultural tools did it provide? What new identities or relationships did it enable? What new social spaces did it open? So as I noted, my entryway into the subject was the tourist industry. And I always like to begin talking about Jewish heritage tourism in Poland by comparing two slides that I think really nicely encapsulate the great mismatch in the dominant conceptions of Poland's Jewish heritage for Poles and for Jews. So this first map, and actually this is just a fragment of a larger map. This is a map that was produced for years. It may actually still be being produced by Poland's, what was then National Tourist Bureau, Orbis, called Jewish Heritage in Poland. And if you look at the key there, you can see that's the map is titled Jewish Heritage in Poland. And you can see that there are many different icons there, the different colored squares. And if you look at the key, you can see there are mentioned synagogues and houses of prayer that are open, other synagogues, cemeteries, ghettos during World War II, Nazi death camps, Nazi concentration camps, other important sites of Jewish history, and centers of Hasidism. So a relatively wide array of sites of interest of Jewish heritage in Poland. And then I'd like to compare that with this second map. This is a map that I picked up from an Israeli tourist bureau that sends Jewish youth on tours to Poland, which every 11th grade Israeli class makes such a trip. It's a sort of institutionalized aspect of Israeli nation building. And you can see this is the whole map, which actually matches the whole map of if I showed the outlines of the previous map, of course, the outlines of all of Poland, the Polish state today. I think very significantly, it has exactly the same title, Jewish Heritage in Poland. But as you can see, the key here only has two items that are listed on the map, and that's Nazi death camps and ghettos during World War II. And so I think that this is a really useful sort of visual shorthand to look at this incredible narrowing of the scope of what actually might be included in our ideas of what is authentic Jewish heritage in Poland today. What is actually that which we have inherited. So how to reconcile these two visions? Reconciliation itself is a notion that's gotten a lot of attention in recent years with reference to the many post-conflict societies around the world where former enemies have to live side by side. And reconciliation is mostly discussed in terms of formalized procedures like truth commissions or formal state apologies. But I started to think about how reconciliation looks in everyday life, in more quotidian experiences of truth-telling, of dialogue, of working through, in encounters with mythologized people and places, and in the recreation of social networks across the boundaries of difference. It seemed to me that Kazimierz, in a number of both accidental and also intentional ways, facilitated post-Holocaust reconciliation understood in these terms. Kazimierz, due to its lively gentrification and its renewed signification as a Jewish space, is an important social catchment area. It is, quite simply, a place where, sitting under the umbrellas of Jewish-themed cafes, tasting someone's version of Polish Jewish food, and talking to tour guides or passers-by, visiting Jewish families are often moved to tell difficult, personal stories, and they're also moved to new cultural insights and sort of intergenerational reckonings. And I will offer a vignette. A Holocaust survivor visiting Poland from the States had noticed me and some Jewish friends in the square in Kazimierz, in Szeroka Street, and he came hurrying over. He had actually yelled out, "Oh, Jews," when he saw us, and ran over. I'm not sure how he could tell. And as is quite typical in Kazimierz, he in no time was telling his wartime story right there in the middle of the street. I told him, he was with his daughter, and I told them about my research, and his daughter said to me, "How can you bear to live here?" Just at that moment, a Polish friend walked by, and he and I exchanged a few words in Polish, and the survivor's face just completely lit up, and he said, "Oh my gosh, you speak Polish." "My kids never learned Polish," he said, shaking his lowered head in apparent regret. His daughter then, looking away, said to the air, "He never taught us Polish." A moment later, she turned back to me and snapped, "Why do you speak Polish?" One can hear in this vignette the painful ambivalence in the meaning of the Polish language in Jewish experience. On the one hand, it seems to serve as a symbol of cultural distance and otherness, perhaps inauthenticity for the daughter. And on the other hand, for the father, it's a very intimate, deeply felt locus of identity. In this moment, Polish language surfaces as a potential but disrupted link between parent and child, between Polishness and Jewishness. If this vignette illustrates one function of Kazimierz for visiting Jews, it also has profound significance for local Jews. Kazimierz has profound significance. During the 1990s and early 2000s in Poland, there were very few spaces where one could be Jewish openly. In the entire country, there were a tiny handful of religious community offices and a couple of synagogues and communist-era associations filled mostly with older men. These venues were intimidating or unattractive to this new wave of individuals across the country who were suddenly coming out of the woodwork with a variety of newly discovered or newly expressed connections to Jewishness and a desire to explore these and share with other individuals in similar predicaments. Kazimierz served as a uniquely lively, safe space for Jewishness in a newly democratic Poland. It really felt different, even just from the rest of Krakow. Not only did many Polish Jews feel it to be a rare place where one could, for example, wear a yarmulke openly, but as Stanisław Krajewski, who's a prominent member of the Warsaw Jewish community, who spends a lot of time in Kazimierz, he told me in 2007 that Kazimierz is a place where it feels more appropriate to wear a yarmulke than not to wear one. Significantly, Kazimierz was also a place where the whole range of individuals who had these very complex, often completely subjective connections to Jewishness that are really native to post-Holocaust, post-communist Poland, could tentatively step out into the light. Numerous hybrid figures poured into the new opening that Kazimierz's Jewish venues provided. These included what one observer called marginally Jewish Jews, non-halachic Jews, and Catholics of Jewish origin. Not to mention entirely non-Jews who were Jewish identified as a sort of cultural comfort zone or even as a political project. Each of them, I should stress, from older, long-time community members to the newest of new Jews, drew different distinctions between what they viewed as Kazimierz's authentic Jewish sites and those that they dismissed as fake. So it always depended on one's standpoint. Everyone was always dismissing the next venue over as fake, but the one they were sitting in as real. Moreover, public space for Jews was arguably the first public space for social or cultural difference of any kind in post-communist Poland after an era of state-enforced cultural homogeneity. Because of this, a wide range of marginalized individuals, from ethnic and racial to sexual minorities, were drawn into it, seeing in Jewishness a space for difference, plain and simple. Through the 1990s, Kazimierz's Jewish venues took all comers, and their character was shaped by their clientele. These cafes and shops were petri dishes for experiments in Jewish identification, some of which grew in more normative direction, and so some people sort of graduated to Jewish community membership or even conversion, while others developed into entirely new ways of understanding one's Polishness. But more than just a space for Jewishness, Kazimierz became what historian Diana Pinto calls a Jewish space, emerging in Europe in recent decades. And her definition of Jewish space is, quote, an open cultural and even political agora where Jews and non-Jews interact on Jewish themes, or where a Jewish voice can make itself felt. Kazimierz as a neighborhood was re-engaged and developed by local activist entrepreneurs who created cafes, bookshops, and cabarets that formed a crucial platform not only for Jewish life, but for intercultural encounters, which are mediated by a sort of front line of cultural heritage stewards, brokers, and guides. These Shabbos Goyim, as some of them have actually called themselves, form a crucial interface for visitors, shaping their experience of Poland's Jewish heritage. Such Jewishly sympathetic, engaged, knowledgeable young Poles can have a profound impact on visiting Jews, often prompting them to rethink their very bleak assumptions about Poland and Poles, as well as their own family and community relationships to this place. Many visitors described to me what one of them called a, quote, reality rearranging experiences on finding their non-Jewish guide intensely knowledgeable and interested in Jewish culture and history. Recognitions on the part of Jewish visitors of their own Polishness was also common. For some, there's the shock of finding Polish faces familiar, like the well-traveled young American woman who expressed shock looking at faces on the street in Poland and noting that, in her words, quote, "It was the first time I'd ever been somewhere that I feel these people look like me. It was weird, and I felt wrong to think that because my dad's voice was always there saying, 'You are not Polish, you're Jewish.'" For other Jewish visitors, like one Israeli woman I met, there's recognizing for the first time one's own parents' Polishness in the habits of local people, how they eat, how they greet each other, or simply how they fold a napkin in one of Kazimierz's cafes. Visiting Jews, for their part, are also catalysts for Poles to rethink their own relationships to history and identity and Jewishness. I witnessed many moving cases of introspection prompted by such encounters. And to illustrate these, I'll actually borrow some examples from Magdalena Waligórska's work on the klezmer revival. The klezmer revival in Central Europe has been a particularly controversial aspect of the Jewish revival, which generated much media attention. Klezmer made the headlines mostly because of the fact that its protagonists and audiences were and still are mostly non-Jewish, and because many critics thought that the aspect of performance was particularly troubling. One of the claims that critics put forward was that klezmer is a form of therapy for guilty consciences, while others accused it of being a form of entertainment, or as a form of entertainment, it erases the tragedy of the Holocaust. In her research on musicians, producers, and organizers of klezmer events, Magdalena discovered that the particular context of live music performance allows specific modes of sociability, not only more intimate contact and an exchange between the audience and the performer, but also an opportunity for performers to temporarily stand in the place of the other. These particular modes of Jewish, non-Jewish encounter, which also apply to my own research in Jewish tourism, can be called critique, cooperation, and standing in. Virtually all of the non-Jewish klezmer musicians interviewed said that one of the first questions they faced after a concert was, "How can you play Jewish music if your people murdered the Jews?" One of the artists said, quote, "There's no chance to escape that. Everybody asks you why? Why this? Are you not? How can you? How do you feel?" When I was doing other music before, nobody was interested in that. Nobody was asking, "Why do you play this music?" Since then, of course, I've had to think about why I do this. Performing Jewish culture, whether as a musician or as a tour guide, is a frontline experience where the protagonists have to constantly confront the painful Polish Jewish or German Jewish past and reflect on their own role, their own motivations in engaging with Jewish culture. Cooperation on the klezmer scene naturally occurs between Jewish and non-Jewish musicians, but it also involves local Jewish communities in ways that are not possible elsewhere for the average Polish person. One great story from Magdalena's book is how Rabbi Sasha Pekarich of the Lauder Foundation was looking for Jewish musicians to play at a rare Jewish wedding that he was officiating at in the 1990s in Kazimierz. Lacking Jewish musicians in Krakow, he turned to a klezmer band from one of these local Jewish-themed cafes. The band members were anxious at this prospect, having never played at a traditional Jewish communal event, and when they auditioned for Rabbi Sasha, he said, "Well, that's Jewish, but it's not Jewish." Undaunted, Sasha proceeded to lend them a videotape of his own wedding, based on which they honed their Yiddishkeit. Such cooperation takes the form not only of opportunities to learn about the culture of the other, but also to actually stand in for the other, in situations where the other is missing. One of the most striking examples comes from a German musician performing Yiddish songs who reported the following incident in Tarnów in southeastern Poland during his tour. He said, "There were probably no Jews there, apart from one woman who always came to the concerts. And afterwards she approached me and said, in Yiddish, 'Don't tell anybody that I speak Yiddish. Nobody knows that.'" So here, the non-Jewish musician, because of his competence in Yiddish, becomes the addressee of a personal story that's actually meant for Jewish ears. His role as a performer of Yiddish music transforms him into the recipient of emotions and recollections that he receives for the lack of any other Jewish person that this Polish Holocaust survivor could confide in. Here, the German musician, designated by the Jewish Yiddish speaker as an insider, performs the role of a stand-in. So both Magdalena and I began asking ourselves a similar question. If we find non-Jews playing at a Jewish wedding, or a non-Jew who has his door smeared with anti-Semitic graffiti because he sings Yiddish songs, or if non-Jewish owners of a Jewish bookshop greet a steady flow of Jewish tourists who tearfully entrust them with their painful stories of Polish anti-Semitism, is the most important question to ask whether what is being created here is authentic Jewish culture. We both concluded that a far more important question is, what function do Jewish tour guides or klezmer cafes have in this context, in this new context, and what are the long-term consequences of these phenomena for those who engage with it? What happens to non-Jews who are involved in the production of Jewish heritage after 10 years or 20 years? It turns out that this type of intense encounter, which forces the Polish participants to confront Polish anti-Semitism, can have important consequences for their identities. Of course, one result can be self-defense. Which may even border on a sort of anti-Semitic reaction. So as one klezmer musician said, why don't they come here and play this music themselves? Why don't they come here and settle down and live in this reality? Instead, they escaped to the United States. Why do they ban us from playing this music? This extreme end of the spectrum simply ignores any Polish responsibility for the absence of Jews. But a contrasting strategy, and one that we both saw quite frequently in our research, is an embrace of an identity beyond the categories of Jewish or non-Jewish. The discovery of Jewish roots often provokes this kind of embrace, and the story of the band Kroka is a good example. One band member told of how his uncle came to him and asked, Tomek, Tomek, why do you play this music? And Tomek said, because I like it. And his uncle said, so now I'll explain to you why you like it. And then he divulged to Tomek that Tomek's grandfather had been Jewish, which was a total shock for him. Now, a final question is, how might we view the cultural products that are emanating from this contact zone where Polish and Jewish culture are re-encountering each other? And I'd like to here play a short fragment of klezmer music. It's just about 1.5 minutes that actually originates from Germany, but it nevertheless illustrates the kind of intriguing intertwined creative currents that exist also in the Polish scene. And so, Pan Jacek up there, if I could have the music, please.
Es ist nicht so kein Nächten, es noch nicht so der Morgen, es ist noch da ein bisschen ein, steht ihm nicht mit Sorgen. Es ist nicht so kein Nächten, es noch nicht so der Morgen, es ist noch da ein bisschen ein, steht ihm nicht mit Sorgen. Bengal High, das nicht mit Zwang. Gestern, das war gestern, morgen, das ist morgen. Wir haben bloß ein Bengal High, das nicht mit Zwang.
So Yiddish and yodeling might not be what you expect when you first think of klezmer music. The piece that I just played it's a traditional Chabad Lubavitcher nigun with lyrics translated into the Bavarian dialect by Andrea Panzur, the vocalist of the record on which the song appears, which is called Alpenklezmer, 2012, which she recorded together with the Latvian accordionist Ilya Šneves. Very obviously, this music is not an attempt at an authentic recreation of historic klezmer, but rather a translation, a product filtered through the sensitivities and interests of a new group of producers and consumers. Magdalena cleverly borrows a term from linguistics here when she's describing this, comparing this kind of new artistic product to a Creole language. Creoles are created in places where people speak many different languages, where cultures meet. They're intensely innovative hybrid forms, and not incidentally, or not insignificantly, they're also widely considered impure, bastardized, and generally worse than the other normal languages. Yet over time, a Creole, which is born out of this mess of intense transitory cultural circumstances, becomes the new native language for a next generation. And what both Magdalena and I have tried to capture in our books are the circumstances surrounding the birth of this new generation. I'm actually going to just skip these. Whoops. Sorry. So I don't have time to give you a whole Poland-wide tour, but it's worth just noting that the Jewish, non-Jewish contact zone extends far beyond Krakow's Kazimierz, and it takes different forms. So this map shows the sites of Jewish festivals and Jewish museums across Poland. And you can see that there are some, the green triangles are festivals, and then the blue stars are museums. And some of these are in quite provincial areas, like Chmielnik or Włodawa. And then there's also this dizzying array of other new kinds of initiatives, including local commemorations and artistic projects undertaken by Polish artists, sometimes in collaboration with Israelis, with North American Jews, or with Germans. This represents a whole range of projects. This is a Spring in Warsaw by the Israeli theater group Public Movement. Up in the right corner is Rafał Bedlejewski's barn burning to commemorate the pogrom in Jedwabne. Up in the left-hand corner is the Shalom Foundation's exhibition, and I still see their faces, and many others in the center is Yael Bartana's trilogy. So all of these different projects have their own local contexts and geneses, but their sheer number indicates that the Jewish space in Poland is increasing, not shrinking, a sign of possibility, and an illustration of Poland's Jewish heritage as an evolving process rather than some sort of static scansion. To conclude, while my goals today have been to ask us to look beneath the surface of Jewish cultural phenomena that are often dismissed as inauthentic, to see their complexity and potential, of course, I also recognize that not all of these phenomena are uniformly positive. As this slide illustrates, just as there are high-minded engagements with Jewish culture, there are many lesser engagements that risk really reinforcing and perpetuating long-standing negative stereotypes of Jews simply for the amusement of their consumers. And on the left, you see sort of one of the more stereotypical or images that plays on these really kind of nefarious historic stereotypes of in relation to Jews and money. And on the right, again, I mean, you see in the klezmer context, caricatured Jews with, holding Polish money, etc. Further, the Jewish heritage revival can sometimes be motivated by larger projects, for example, of regional economic development, or they can also be appropriated by state functionaries who may use the Jewish revival in a really gross oversimplification as a rosy sign that all is well with Poland and Poland's relationship to Jews, both past and present. So look, we have a Jewish festival. What could possibly be wrong? So while we should be ever mindful of these larger political projects, it's worth asking ourselves whether our concerns about authenticity may at times draw our attention away from important questions about renewal, creativity, hybridity, and heritage caretaking. And most importantly, from new ways of imagining cultural interconnectedness rather than cultural boundaries. Perhaps the best approach is to find ways to involve ourselves in the highly productive energies that have been unleashed in Poland's very unique and very significant Jewish heritage revival. Thank you.